He's not a therapist. He's a delivery driver. Get him away from my child right now." Gareth Morrow's voice cut through the midday noise of the Westfield Galleria food court, his blue jacket sharp against the chaos, his finger leveled at Finnian Drake like a verdict. Around them, shoppers had stopped moving. A circle had formed. Claire, 17, trembling, her orange sneakers grinding against the tile as she rocked, had been mid-meltdown for nearly an hour when Finnian Drake set down his delivery bag, lowered himself slowly to her level, and began talking in a voice so quiet no one else could hear it. In 4 minutes she was breathing. In 6 her hand was in his. The 2 security guards who'd spent 40 minutes trying to reach her stood useless at the edge of the circle. The nanny had her face in her hands, and Gareth Morrow, real estate mogul, a man who'd paid every expert in the city, walked straight past all of it and told the officer in the short-sleeved uniform, "Get that man out of my mall." He never asked what Finnian Drake said to her. That was his first mistake. It would not be his last. Welcome to Frost Folktales. This is where we tell the stories of those who were underestimated, dismissed, and targeted, yet chose courage over silence. If these stories move you, subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let them fade into the background. It was a Saturday in early October, and the Westfield Galleria was exactly what it always was on a Saturday. A river of noise and movement, sneaker squeaks on marble, the competing smells of a dozen food vendors, children running ahead of parents who called after them without slowing down. Natural light poured through the massive skylight ceiling panels in thick, clean columns, meeting the blaze of overhead fluorescent lights that left no shadow unlit, no corner of the food court in anything but full, merciless brightness. It was the kind of light that made everything visible. That would matter. Claire Morrow had been sitting wedged against a food court support pillar for 57 minutes. She was 17, slight-framed, wearing an orange hoodie and denim shorts. Her orange sneakers planted flat on the marble tile with the mechanical rhythm of someone whose body had long since taken over from her mind. Back and forth, back and forth. The rocking was violent enough that her shoulder blades scraped the pillar with each cycle. Her hands were pressed against both sides of her head, not covering her ears but pressing inward, as if she were trying to hold something in or push something out. Her eyes were open but not seeing anything in the food court. They were looking at something much farther away, or nothing at all. The sound she was making was low, continuous, and devastating. A single sustained note that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite a cry, but lived in the exact middle of both. 2 security guards in black polo shirts and black trousers stood 6 feet away from her, positioned at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock, neither moving. They had been standing exactly there for the better part of 40 minutes. One of them had his arms crossed, not out of defiance, out of helplessness. His arms had simply gone there because there was nowhere else to put them. They had tried everything the training said to try. They had spoken calmly. They had backed away. They had asked her to look at them. None of it worked. They were large men, rendered completely weightless by a 17-year-old girl's nervous system, doing what it needed to do. Elaine Chu, Claire's nanny, stood to the left of the guards, with her back turned entirely to the scene, both hands pressed over her face. She had not turned around in 12 minutes. The shaking in her shoulders said she was either crying or controlling something very close to it. She had been with Claire for 2 years. She knew what this looked like when it ended badly. She knew what it looked like right now. A mall manager in a green polo shirt and khaki trousers hovered at the edge of the growing crowd with a walkie-talkie pressed to his chest, looking from his watch to the crowd, to the girl and back again. He had called his supervisor. His supervisor had called building management. Someone was supposedly coming. No one had come. The ring of bystanders had started as a few curious passers-by and grown into a crowd of 40 or 50 people, held in place less by obligation and more by the strange gravity of a situation no one knew how to leave. Phones were up. Some people were filming. Some people were not filming because something in the scene made filming feel like the wrong thing to do, though they couldn't have explained why. Nobody went closer. Finnian Drake came through the service corridor entrance on the east side of the food court at 12:43 in the afternoon. A red and black delivery jacket over gray joggers, a large insulated thermal bag hanging from his right shoulder. He was taking a shortcut. He had 3 more deliveries before his shift break, and the service corridor shaved 4 minutes off the route. He wasn't looking for anything. He was looking at his delivery app screen, updating his arrival status. He heard the crowd before he saw it. He looked up. He saw Claire. He stopped walking. He stood very still for approximately 4 seconds, which was long enough for something to happen behind his eyes, a kind of recognition that had nothing to do with having met her before. He didn't know her. He had never seen her, but he looked at the way she was rocking, the position of her hands, the angle of her body against the pillar, the way her sneakers maintained that rhythm even as the rest of her seemed to be in agony. And he understood something that the 40 people standing in a ring around her had not understood in nearly an hour. She wasn't asking to be rescued. She was asking to not be alone in it. He set his thermal bag down on the tile beside a nearby table. He walked toward her slowly, not directly, angling his approach from the side the way you approach a fire, not head-on, not from behind. One of the security guards stepped forward and said something. Finnian Drake held up one hand at his side, palm out, not aggressive, just wait. The guard stopped. Perhaps it was the steadiness of the gesture. Perhaps it was something in Finnian Drake's face. The guard stopped. Finnian Drake sat down on the tile floor, not crouching, not kneeling. He folded himself cross-legged onto the marble, 3 feet from Claire Morrow, close enough to be present and far enough to not be a threat. The overhead fluorescent light and the skylight above poured directly down on both of them, like a stage that nobody had designed, but that fit perfectly anyway. He did not say her name. He did not say anything with volume. He began to speak in a voice so low and so even that the nearest person in the crowd, standing 10 feet back, could not catch a single word. What they could observe was everything else. His hands rested on his own knees, palms up, open. He did not reach toward her. He did not make the mistake of reaching toward her. His eye contact was calibrated, not fixed on her face in the way that demands response, but settled somewhere near her, present and available without being an interrogation. He was breathing slowly and audibly, and after a moment, a careful observer would have noticed that his breathing had found the same rhythm as hers, not mocking it, not forcing it, simply accompanying it, the way one instrument joins another without drowning it out. His voice had a cadence that rose and fell with the patience of someone who had nowhere else to be and no deadline beyond this moment. He was not giving instructions. He was not asking questions. He was simply talking, existing in sound beside her the way you exist in silence beside someone you trust. At minute 2, her rocking did not slow, but it changed quality. The violence went out of it by a small but measurable degree. At minute 3, her hands came away from the sides of her head. They rested in her lap. She was still rocking, but her hands were free. At minute 4, the rocking slowed. The crowd noticed. A woman in the ring put her hand over her mouth. The mall manager lowered his walkie-talkie. One of the security guards uncrossed his arms. At minute 5, Claire Morrow's eyes, which had been fixed on the middle distance, moved. They moved toward Finnian Drake. Not at him, not yet, but toward him, the way you look toward a sound that might be music. At minute 6, her hand reached across the tile and found his. She did not look at him when she did it. She simply reached, and his hand was there, palm up and waiting, and her fingers settled into it as naturally as a key finding its lock. Her rocking stopped. The sound stopped. The food court, which had been a river of noise, went so completely quiet that the fluorescent lights became audible. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For perhaps 30 seconds, the entire food court held its breath around a delivery driver and a 17-year-old girl sitting on a tile floor in the most complete silence a mall had probably ever known. Then the east entrance doors opened. Gareth Morrow walked in like a man who owned the floor he was walking on, because he very nearly did. Blue jacket, pressed charcoal trousers, shoes that reflected the overhead lights back upward. Theron Vance, his head of security, wide-shouldered, dark suit, earpiece, flanked him at the left. Gareth Morrow's eyes swept the crowd, swept the security guards, swept the nanny, swept the ring of frozen bystanders, and landed on Finnian Drake. He did not ask what happened. He did not ask how long she had been in distress. He did not ask who the young black man on the floor was, or what he had done to bring his daughter to stillness after 57 minutes of agony. He did none of those things. He calculated the optics, made a determination, and spoke. "Get him away from my daughter." Now, Officer Clint Rourke, short-sleeved uniform, badge catching the skylight, stepped forward from the perimeter. He looked once at Finnian Drake. He looked once at Claire. He saw what he saw. He stepped forward anyway. The moment Finnian Drake was pulled to his feet, Claire Morrow screamed. It was not the sound from before, not the low, sustained private sound of a nervous system overwhelmed. This was different. This was the sound of something being taken. It filled the food court from marble floor to skylight ceiling, and it bounced off every surface and came back, and it did not stop. Gareth Morrow had walked in looking for a threat to remove. He had just become one. And the question that would follow him for the next 7 years, the question he never thought to ask in that first moment, was the simplest one of all. What did Finnian Drake say to her? Before we talk about what happened after the handcuffs clicked into place, we need to talk about who Finnian Drake actually was before he ever walked into that food court, because the world saw a delivery driver on the floor next to someone else's daughter. Gareth Morrow saw a trespasser. Officer Clint Rourke saw an incident report waiting to be filed. But none of them saw the full picture. None of them asked. And that is exactly the kind of oversight that costs people everything. Finnian Drake was 23 years old. His alarm went off at 4:45 every morning, 6 days a week. Not because he wanted it to, not because he was the kind of person who thrives before sunrise, but because the warehouse on Delmar Avenue started its first sorting shift at 5:30, and the bus that got him there left at 5:07. And missing that bus meant missing the shift, and missing the shift meant a deduction, and a deduction meant the math stopped working. Finnian Drake's entire life ran on math that could not afford to stop working. He wore a gray thermal undershirt beneath a faded navy hoodie for those morning shifts, along with dark work trousers and steel-capped boots he had bought secondhand and resold twice. The warehouse was cold in the mornings regardless of the season. Something about the way the loading dock doors were always half open, and Finnian Drake had learned in his first week to dress for where the job actually happened, not for the temperature outside. He would finish the warehouse shift at 11, take a different bus home, eat whatever he had prepped the night before, usually rice and protein, sometimes just eggs, and be back out the door by noon in his red and black delivery jacket and gray joggers, the thermal bag slung over one shoulder, his phone mounted on a cheap clip attached to his bicycle handlebar. The delivery route ran until 6 or 7 in the evening depending on order volume. On weekends, after the Saturday morning deliveries, he would go to the Crescent Hill Community Center on Fairfax and work the janitorial shift until 10 at night. 3 jobs, 6 days. The 7th he spent doing laundry, grocery shopping for the week, and sitting beside his mother at the dialysis center on Route 9 for 4 hours, while the machine did what her kidneys could no longer do on their own. He did not complain about any of this, not to anyone. If you asked Finnian Drake how he was doing, he would say fine, or he would say busy, and he would ask you something about yourself before you had a chance to follow up. He was not performing humility, he was simply a person who had decided, at some point between his mother's first diagnosis and the insurance company's second denial letter, that spending energy on bitterness was a luxury he could not afford. He put that energy somewhere else. He put it into the textbooks stacked beside his bed. They were not decorative. The spines were cracked, pages were dog-eared and annotated in pencil, so that library copies could be erased and returned. The second-hand ones he owned outright, purchased from used bookstore bins and online resale listings, were filled with his own notes in the margins. Entire conversations he was having with the authors across the pages. Behavioral science, autism spectrum research, co-regulation theory, sensory processing frameworks, developmental neuroscience written for clinicians that Finnian Drake was reading by phone flashlight on his lunch break, sitting on a concrete step outside a restaurant's back entrance with a half-eaten sandwich in his other hand. 2 years earlier, he had received an acceptance letter from the Hargrove School of Behavioral Sciences, fully accredited graduate program, one of the best in the region for his intended specialization. He had read that letter 4 times, folded it carefully, and placed it in the top drawer of his dresser, where it still was. He had deferred his enrollment when Nadia Drake's condition escalated and their insurance collapsed within the same 6-week window. He had called the admissions office himself, explained the situation calmly, and asked whether an indefinite deferral was possible. They gave him 1 year. He called again at the 12-month mark and asked for another. They gave him a second with reluctance and a warning that a third would require reapplication. He had not called about the 3rd year yet. His best friend, Yolanda Ferris, who drove the same delivery zone and had known Finnian Drake since they were teenagers in the same apartment complex, had exactly one opinion about all of this, and she delivered it regularly and without apology. She was a compact woman with natural hair pinned up beneath a bright orange headband, usually wearing a green zip-up jacket over a white fitted tee and black leggings for her delivery shifts, and she had a way of looking at Finnian Drake like she was simultaneously proud of him and furious at him for the same reasons. "You are literally studying for a career you refuse to start," she told him once, leaning against her bike outside a sandwich shop while he had a textbook open across his knee. "That's like training for a marathon from a couch you won't get up from." "I'm getting up," Finnian Drake said, without looking up from the page. "I'm just getting up in a specific order, the order being everyone else first and you never, the order being my mother first and then me." Yolanda Ferris had no answer for that, which was unusual for her, so she ate her sandwich and read over his shoulder for 10 minutes and then asked him to explain what co-regulation meant. And he did, and she listened more carefully than she let on. The gift, though, the thing Finnian Drake did in that food court, that did not come from the textbooks. The textbooks were giving him the language for something he had always already known how to do. He was 9 years old the first time he noticed it. His younger cousin Marcus had what the family called his episodes. Sudden, overwhelming moments where the noise or the light or the crowd became too much, and Marcus would fold in on himself like a paper crane being crushed. Every adult in the room would panic, which made it worse because Marcus could feel the panic coming off them like heat. Finnian Drake, 9 years old, had figured this out not because anyone told him, but because he had watched it happen enough times to see the pattern. So the next time Marcus started to go under at a family gathering, Finnian Drake simply went and sat next to him on the floor. He did not touch him. He did not speak for almost 2 minutes. He just breathed slowly and deliberately and waited. And when Marcus's breathing started to slowly mirror his without either of them trying to make that happen, Finnian Drake started talking in a low, even voice, about something entirely mundane, the color of the carpet, what he could hear from the kitchen, the way the ceiling fan had a small wobble on its left side. Factual, steady, unhurried. Marcus came back to himself in 4 minutes. Everyone in the room looked at the 9-year-old like he had performed a magic trick. He had not. He had simply paid attention. He volunteered 3 summers at a camp for children with developmental differences in middle and high school. He was not a counselor. He was not trained. He was a teenage kid who showed up because he wanted to, and who had a specific quietness that the children there responded to in a way that consistently surprised the actual staff. He could not always explain what he was doing in those moments, only that it felt like listening with his whole body, reading the signals that other people's nervous systems were broadcasting and responding to them rather than to his own discomfort. Once, on a subway platform at rush hour, he had watched a woman in her 30s begin to hyperventilate while the crowd thickened around her. He had moved through the crowd and stood beside her without announcement and said, in a voice calibrated for exactly her ears and no one else's, "You don't have to go anywhere. You're already where you are. Let's just be here for a second." He did not know her. She did not know him. She caught her breath. The train came. He never saw her again. The gift had always been there. The degree was simply the next step he had not yet been able to afford. Now consider what it cost him when he walked into that food court. The holding room at Westfield Precinct 3 was fluorescent lit and beige, with a bolted table and 2 chairs and a wall-mounted camera in the upper corner. Officer Clint Rourke sat across from Finnian Drake in his short-sleeved uniform and processed the paperwork with the energy of a man performing a task he had decided not to examine too closely. He asked the standard questions. Finnian Drake answered them in full, politely, without elaboration in any direction. He did not argue. He did not explain himself to Officer Rourke, because Officer Rourke had not asked him to. Theron Vance arrived 40 minutes later. He was a broad man in a pressed charcoal suit jacket and dark trousers, carrying a manila envelope with the efficient unhurriedness of someone who did this often. He slid 3 documents across the table: the trespassing charge, a civil no-contact order prohibiting Finnian Drake from any contact with Claire Morrow or the Morrow family, and a letter on heavy cream stationery from Gareth Morrow's legal team that ran to 2 pages and contained the phrase "predatory proximity" twice. Finnian Drake read all 3 documents from beginning to end. He set them back on the table in the same order he had received them. His expression did not change. He was permitted a phone call. He called Nadia Drake. She picked up on the second ring, her voice warm and slightly hoarse the way it always was in the late afternoon. "You okay, baby?" "Yes, ma'am." "You eaten?" "I'm good, Mom." "You sure?" "I'm sure." She told him she loved him. He told her the same. He did not tell her where he was calling from, or why, or what 3 sheets of legal paper on a bolted table in a beige room meant for the careful architecture of a life he had built to survive. He said goodnight, and he hung up, and he sat with his hands folded in front of him under the fluorescent light, and he did not let his face do anything at all. By 8 o'clock that evening, the delivery company had sent a formal notification to his account. Incident liability, account suspended pending review. The review was a formality. He knew it even as he read the notification on his phone screen in the dark outside the precinct. 1 afternoon. 1 act, 1 job gone, and still, the most dangerous thing in that room was not the paperwork. It was the fact that nobody in that building thought to ask what the girl had looked like when his hand found hers. The Morrow house was a $4.2 million statement in architectural glass and poured concrete, perched above the city on a hill that cost more to grade than most people earned in a decade. Every room had floor-to-ceiling windows. Natural light poured in from every angle from morning until dusk. It was the kind of home designed to make people feel like they were living inside something important. In the 3 weeks following the Westfield Galleria, it had never felt emptier. Claire Morrow no longer ate in the kitchen. It happened gradually at first. She would drift toward the kitchen doorway, stand there in her orange hoodie and gray sweatpants, and then retreat without explanation. By the second week, she stopped appearing in the kitchen entirely. Elaine Chu began bringing trays to Claire's room, small, careful arrangements of foods with the textures and temperatures Claire tolerated, and leaving them just inside the door without speaking. Speaking made things worse now. Everything made things worse now. Gareth Morrow watched the house change shape around his daughter's grief and told himself it was temporary, a phase, an adjustment period. He used the language of business because it was the only language he was fluent in. Setback, recalibration, short-term disruption before recovery. He made phone calls. He wrote checks. He did what he had always done when the world presented a problem. He deployed resources. The clinic was called the Hargrove Institute, a name that appeared in 4 separate rankings of top behavioral health providers for adolescents. Their intake coordinator had warm lighting in her office and a wall of framed certifications, and spoke with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to reassuring frightened wealthy parents. Their rate was $800 per session, 3 sessions per week, with an additional $1,200 monthly coordination fee. Gareth Morrow signed the paperwork the same afternoon he received it. He did not hesitate over the number. Numbers had never been the problem. The Hargrove team's lead therapist was a Dr. Weston Price, thin, silver-haired, author of 2 academic books that sat in a specific kind of university library where the spines never cracked. He arrived at the Morrow house for his first session with a leather satchel, a voice carefully modulated for clinical warmth, and 17 years of credentials. He entered Claire Morrow's room, introduced himself in a calm and practiced cadence, and sat in the chair Elaine Chu had positioned at the recommended distance from where Claire sat cross-legged on her bed, in her orange hoodie and blue denim shorts and orange sneakers, still wearing the orange sneakers, still as if she hadn't fully returned from the food court floor. Claire Morrow did not look at Dr. Weston Price. She did not acknowledge his presence. She pressed the heels of both palms flat against her ears and began rocking. Dr. Price made notes. He returned the following Tuesday. Claire pressed her palms against her ears again. He returned Thursday. She turned her face to the wall. He returned the following week, and the week after that. And by the end of the first month, the notes he wrote were clinical and precise and documented 0 measurable progress in any category. Gareth Morrow received these reports in his home office, a room with a broad mahogany desk and a view of the city below, and read them the way he read quarterly earnings projections that disappointed him. He would make a quiet sound in his throat. He would send an email requesting an escalated intervention plan. He would not let himself think about the food court. Margot Morrow let herself think about nothing else. She was 41. With dark hair she wore pulled back and a stillness about her that people sometimes mistook for coldness, and was actually the stillness of a woman who had been holding too much for too long. She had been Claire's primary caregiver since Claire was diagnosed at age 3. She had read every book, attended every conference, fired 3 specialists, hired 4 more, and learned to function on 5 hours of sleep without complaint. She loved Claire Morrow with a ferocity that did not require an audience, and she had been standing 12 feet from that food court pillar. She had seen everything. It was a Sunday morning, 6 weeks after the Galleria, when Margot walked into Gareth's office while he was on a call and stood in front of his desk and waited. He wrapped up the call. He looked at her with the expression he wore when he was prepared to be efficient. She sat down in the chair across from him, folded her hands on her knee, and said it quietly and without accusation. What if he was actually helping her? Gareth Morrow's expression did not change immediately. There was a brief reorganization behind his eyes, a filing, a categorizing, And then he leaned back in his chair and said he was a delivery driver who inserted himself into a private family situation. He was sitting on the floor, Margot said. And she took his hand. Margot. She took his hand. Gareth. She has never taken anyone's hand. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Gareth smoothed the front of his blue jacket with one palm, a gesture Margot recognized as the physical equivalent of closing a tab on a browser. I've engaged the best team in the city, he said. Hargrove has a— I know what Hargrove has, she said. I've read the reports. She did not say anything else. She stood up and left the office. The question remained in the room after she was gone, and Gareth Morrow sat with it for approximately 90 seconds before picking up his phone and making a different call entirely. Desmond Farrow was not a large man. He wore a green polo shirt and dark trousers, and had the look of someone who had been underestimated so frequently he had turned it into a professional advantage. He was thorough, discreet, and genuinely good at his work, which made him, in Gareth Morrow's estimation, worth every dollar of his retainer. Gareth gave him the name Finnian Drake, the date of the incident, the delivery company whose jacket the young man had been wearing, and told him to build a complete picture. Desmond Farrow took 10 days. He did not rush because rushing produced incomplete pictures, and incomplete pictures had gotten clients of his into serious trouble before. He cross-referenced employment records, pulled public financial filings, reviewed social media going back 6 years, checked criminal databases at the county and state level, contacted 3 of Finnian Drake's former employers under the pretext of reference verification, and reviewed the publicly available record of his deferred graduate school acceptance. He arranged to meet Gareth Morrow in Gareth's office on a Thursday afternoon. He sat across the mahogany desk with a thin folder in front of him and a neutral expression that Gareth Morrow, who was good at reading people, could not decode. Desmond Farrow opened the folder, placed it facing Gareth, and let him read the first page before he said anything. He's clean, Desmond said. No criminal record of any kind, no restraining orders, no civil suits filed or pending against him, no associations of concern in any database I have access to. His social media presence is minimal, mostly food delivery check-ins and a few posts about his mother's health treatments. He paused. 3 jobs, Mr. Morrow. Warehouse in the mornings, delivery in the afternoons, janitorial on weekends. His mother has a chronic kidney condition. He was accepted to a behavioral science graduate program and deferred enrollment to cover her medical costs. Gareth Morrow turned a page in the folder. His expression remained arranged. Desmond Farrow leaned forward slightly. He was not typically in the business of editorializing. He made an exception. His graduate acceptance was in behavioral therapy with a concentration in developmental disabilities, he said. That's what the program was, the one he deferred. He watched Gareth Morrow's face for a response and received very little. Mr. Morrow, I've been doing this kind of work for 14 years. I've investigated men who hurt children. I know what that picture looks like. This isn't it. He kept his voice even and professional. You may want to reconsider your position on this. Gareth Morrow nodded once. He said, "Thank you, Desmond. I appreciate the thoroughness." He took the folder, aligned it precisely with the edge of the desk, opened the bottom right drawer, and placed the folder inside. He closed the drawer. He said, "Send the invoice to Theron." Desmond Farrow looked at him for a moment. Then he collected his own empty hands from the desk, stood, and left the office. He did not say anything else. He was not paid to say anything else. In a small apartment on the east side of the city, Elaine Chu sat at her kitchen table under the overhead light with a composition notebook open in front of her. She had purchased it 3 days after the Galleria incident and had been writing in it a little at a time ever since, not in the way of someone writing for an audience, but in the careful, deliberate way of someone trying to preserve something fragile before it dissolved. She wrote what she had seen, the way Finnian Drake had set his thermal bag down without hesitation, The way he had lowered himself to the floor, not crouching above Claire, but actually sitting, actually level, actually there. The specific way he had tilted his head at a slight angle and kept his gaze soft and indirect. The rhythm of his breathing and how Claire's breathing had begun to mirror it, without Claire seeming to notice. The exact moment, at minute 4, when Claire's rocking began to slow. The way Claire's right hand had moved across the tile and found his. She wrote what she had seen when Gareth Morrow arrived. She wrote what she had heard him say. She wrote what Claire's face had looked like the moment Finnian Drake was pulled to his feet. She wrote the sound. Elaine Chu did not know yet why she was keeping this record. She was still employed. She had not spoken to anyone about what she had witnessed. Not because she had been told not to, but because she was trying to understand first what it meant and whether she was the right person to carry it. She closed the notebook and put it in the kitchen drawer beside a rubber band and a spare key and a grocery receipt. She turned off the overhead light and went to bed and did not sleep well. 6 months after the Westfield Galleria, on a Tuesday afternoon with pale winter light pressing through the observation window, Gareth Morrow stood in the hallway of the Hargrove Institute's satellite facility and watched through one-way glass as yet another specialist, this one younger, with different credentials and a different approach, and the same fundamental inability to reach the girl on the other side of the room, attempted to establish eye contact with his daughter. Claire sat in an orange hoodie and blue leggings with her knees pulled to her chest, her face turned away, her hands pressed flat against her ears. She had been in that position for 40 minutes. The specialist was speaking in a careful, modulated voice. Claire Morrow was entirely elsewhere. Gareth stood with his arms crossed, and his jaw set, and his eyes on his daughter's turned face. He had signed every check. He had hired every expert. He had done every right and rational thing that his world told him was the correct response to a problem. The problem was not improving. He could feel the contradiction pressing against the inside of his chest, like something that did not have the decency to announce itself as guilt. It was not guilt yet. He would not have called it that. It was only the first hairline fracture in the certainty of a man who had never once considered that the most important thing he'd ever needed to protect his daughter from might have been his own confidence, that he already knew how. 3 years is a long time to become someone. It is also, Finnian Drake had learned, exactly the right amount of time. If you use every single hour of it with the kind of deliberate, grinding, quiet intention that nobody outside your 4 walls ever gets to see. He was 26 now. The delivery jacket was gone. The thermal bag was gone. The pre-dawn warehouse shifts, the weekend mop and bucket, the smell of industrial cleaner permanently embedded in the back of his throat, all of it gone. In their place, a laminated credential on a wall, a clinic on the 3rd floor of a building with a skylight so generously wide that the whole room turned gold in the afternoons, and a waiting list that had just crossed 18 months. 18 months. People waited 18 months to sit across from Finnian Drake. He did not say this with pride. He said it with urgency, because 18 months was too long, and he knew it, and he was already working on expanding hours. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because before any of that, there was a woman named Dr. Ingrid Nakamura. She was 51, compact, perpetually unhurried, in the way that only people who genuinely trust their own judgment tend to be. She wore her silver-streaked hair pulled back, and she had built a career studying the gap between what autism research knew and what clinical practice actually delivered to the most complex, most overlooked, highest support patients on the spectrum. She was not a woman who was easily surprised. Then she read a community center newsletter. It was not a sophisticated document. It was 3 stapled pages, printed on slightly pink paper because someone had put the wrong cartridge in the office machine. distributed to 53 people on a mailing list. The newsletter mentioned in a small paragraph near the back page that the community center's after-school program for kids with developmental differences had seen a remarkable improvement in group engagement since a janitorial staff volunteer named Finnian Drake had begun assisting on Tuesday afternoons. It described in plain language how he sat with the children, how he waited, how he never rushed a transition or raised his voice or withdrew when a child escalated. Dr. Ingrid Nakamura read that paragraph 4 times. Then she drove to the community center on a Tuesday afternoon in a green blazer and dark trousers, and she sat in the back of the room and watched. What she saw in the next 90 minutes, she would later describe in a keynote address as the most instructive clinical observation of her entire career. And she was not a woman given to exaggeration. Finnian Drake, in a faded orange long-sleeve shirt and gray work trousers, moved through that room like someone who understood the nervous system as a language. He co-regulated without drama. He tracked 6 children simultaneously while appearing to focus on one. When a boy named Marcus began building toward a crisis, Finnian was already beside him, not intervening, just present. His breathing slowed, his body angled slightly away to remove pressure, his voice producing a low, even cadence that had no urgency in it at all. Marcus de-escalated in 4 minutes. The certified program aide across the room hadn't noticed the episode beginning. Dr. Nakamura introduced herself afterward. Finnian was polite, measured, a little guarded. She asked him how long he had been working with children on the spectrum. He said, in a way that suggested he had never quite framed it this way before, his whole life, informally. He mentioned the deferred graduate acceptance. He did not mention the Westfield Galleria. He did not mention the arrest. She asked if he would be interested in a funded fellowship. He asked her to repeat that. She did. The fellowship covered full tuition at the graduate program he had deferred. It provided a stipend sufficient to cover Nadia Drake's dialysis costs and the apartment rent. Not luxuriously, but adequately, which was the only word Finnian had ever needed. It required clinical hours that he absorbed like a man who had been waiting 3 years to finally be given formal permission to do what he already knew how to do instinctively. He graduated 2 years later, at the top of his cohort, with a specialization in nonverbal and high-support autism, the tier of cases that made other clinicians quietly suggest a different referral. He did not suggest different referrals. He took the cases other people declined, and he made progress that his supervisors started bringing colleagues in to observe. Now his office existed on the 3rd floor, with that enormous skylight overhead. The walls were warm amber. The lighting at midday was a clean, honest gold that fell evenly across everything without shadow. Sensory tools lined a low shelf along the left wall, arranged by texture and weight, each item in its specific place, because his clients needed to know where things were and that they would not move. There was no desk between him and whoever sat across from him. Just 2 chairs, angled slightly, and a low table, and enough space between them that no one was ever required to feel enclosed. His sessions began at 8 in the morning. On a Tuesday in late October, he worked with a boy named Ezekiel, 7 years old, entirely nonverbal, who had been through 4 previous therapists in 3 years. Ezekiel arrived in a yellow rain jacket and navy trousers, gripping a small metal train car in his left fist. He sat on the floor immediately, which was his preference. Finnian sat on the floor too. They did not attempt communication for the first 11 minutes. They simply existed in the same warm, bright, skylit space. And somewhere in the 12th minute, Ezekiel set his train car down on the floor between them. Finnian did not reach for it. He let it be there. That was the session. To anyone watching, it looked like nothing. It was, in the vocabulary Finnian had spent years building, everything. In the afternoon, he worked with a young woman named Priya, 22, high support needs, who communicated through a tablet system and whose previous facility had described her as treatment-resistant in language that had made Finnian's jaw tighten when he read the file. In their third month together, Priya had begun initiating sessions by pulling up a specific color on her tablet screen and showing it to him when he entered. He had learned to read the colors. Today was a deep blue, which meant she was carrying something heavy and had actively chosen to tell him so. They sat in the afternoon light for 50 minutes. He never told her what to do with the blue. He just confirmed he could see it. That, it turned out, was what she had needed someone to do for years. Late afternoon brought Marcus, not the boy from the community center, a different Marcus, a 9-year-old in a bright green sweatshirt and dark jeans who could speak in bursts and who was working, slowly, on tolerating the sound of other people's voices without a noise-canceling barrier. He sat today with his headphones around his neck rather than over his ears for the first 6 minutes. Finnian counted quietly and said nothing about it. When Marcus put them back on, Finnian nodded like it was a perfectly reasonable decision, which it was. 6 minutes was a record. They both knew it, and neither of them said so. Nadia Drake came to the office that afternoon. She had not told Finnian she was coming. She simply appeared in the waiting room in a blue jacket and dark trousers, her handbag in her lap, looking around at the clean, warm, skylight space with the expression of a woman who is trying to contain something large inside a body that is tired but willing. The receptionist offered her water. She accepted it and sat quietly. When Finnian came out between sessions and saw her, he stopped in the doorway. She looked up. She didn't say anything immediately. She just looked at him, his credentials on the wall behind the reception desk, the calm, purposeful order of the space, the sound of a child's therapist-directed session audible as a low murmur from behind a closed door, and her eyes filled. She did not cry loudly. Nadia Drake had never done anything loudly in her life. She simply sat in that waiting room chair in her blue jacket and let the tears come in a steady, quiet way. The way water moves when it finally finds the direction it's been looking for. Finnian sat down beside her. He did not say it was okay. He did not tell her not to cry. He had spent years learning that the worst thing you can do to someone's emotion is redirect it. He just sat next to his mother in the waiting room of the clinic he had built from a deferred enrollment and a flooded setback and 3 jobs and a community center newsletter, and he let her feel all of it. Yolanda Ferris called him that evening because Yolanda Ferris called him most evenings. She was still driving deliveries, still sharp-tongued, still the only person alive who could make him laugh about things that were not funny. She had sent him 6 different news articles over the past year about the viral potential of his story. Delivery driver becomes top autism therapist after wrongful arrest. She had drafted a social media thread. She had suggested 3 podcasts. Each time, Finnian had said no. Each time, she had called him impossibly stubborn and then asked how Nadia Drake was doing, and then changed the subject because she understood, even when she complained about it, why he refused. He did not want to be the story. He wanted to do the work. He was at his desk at 9 that evening, filing session notes in the clean overhead light of his small office at home, when the email arrived. No name, no referring institution, a single paragraph, written in careful clinical language that someone had assembled from a template or from a document or from somewhere they had learned to approximate medical terminology without actually being medical. A description of a patient, 24-year-old female, high support needs, non-responsive to all current behavioral interventions, multiple residential facility placements, all failed, family seeking specialist consultation at this stage. Finnian read it once. Then he read it again. Something in the clinical language felt familiar in a way he could not immediately locate. Not the words, not the specific phrasing, something underneath all of that. The particular shape of the failure being described, the way each failed placement was listed without detail, the absence of a referring clinician's name in a field that always contained one. He sat with it for a long moment in the quiet, well-lit room. Then he moved his cursor to the small flag icon in his email system, clicked it, and left the message sitting there, marked, unanswered, waiting. He did not respond yet. There is a particular kind of silence that fills a room when a man realizes he has been wrong about everything. Not wrong about a detail, not wrong about a calculation, wrong about the shape of his own character, wrong in a way that cannot be reframed, renegotiated, or managed with the right attorney. Gareth Morrow would not reach that silence for 3 years. The journey to get there would cost him everything he had spent his adult life assembling. And it would begin not with a dramatic unraveling, but with a single employee at a company he had already stopped paying attention to. 18 months after the Westfield Galleria incident, a junior acquisitions coordinator at Morrow Realty Group named Holt Denning forwarded an email to a colleague. The email contained no documents, no financial projections, no sensitive property information. It contained only a story, what Holt Denning had heard from a security contact at the Galleria, pieced together with what he found on a local neighborhood forum thread that had circulated for weeks after the incident. The story described a delivery driver who sat on a food court floor and calmed a girl in crisis. It described the girl's father arriving. It described the arrest that followed. It described the girl screaming as the delivery driver was removed. Holt Denning had added 4 words to the top of the email before forwarding it. Those 4 words were, "This is our boss." The email reached 2 of Morrow Realty Group's largest institutional investors within 72 hours. Neither of them called Gareth Morrow directly. That was how Gareth Morrow first understood the severity, not through confrontation, but through the sudden softening of a scheduled meeting, the polite postponement of a signature, the administrative silence that precedes a decision that has already been made. By month 20, both investors had quietly withdrawn from a joint development in the Eastern Corridor that Gareth Morrow had leveraged into the load-bearing wall of his entire portfolio. When that wall cracked, 4 other projects shuttered. When those projects shuttered, 3 lending institutions recalibrated their risk assessments. The market correction that followed was real, and it hit other developers too. But other developers had not built their financial architecture on foundations already weakened by reputation damage. Gareth Morrow had. The collapse was not sudden. It was methodical, patient, and thorough. The way water finds every available crack in stone and then, over time, splits the stone entirely. Theron Vance left first. He didn't make a scene about it. He simply accepted a position with a private security firm based in Phoenix and submitted his notice with the professional courtesy that had always defined him. Desmond Farrow had already been off retainer for 6 months by then. There was nothing left to investigate, no opposition to surveil, no problem that investigation could fix. The legal team that had drafted the letter threatening Finnian Drake with further action was now redirecting its energy toward defending Gareth Morrow against breach of contract claims from 2 general contractors. The machinery of consequence had turned completely around and was now running directly at the man who had set it in motion. Gareth Morrow's office, during those months, was lit by large south-facing windows that pushed afternoon light across a mahogany desk. He sat at that desk and made calls and sent emails and attended restructuring meetings in orange ties and pressed shirts as though the act of professional presentation could hold the structure upright by sheer force of appearances. It could not. By the end of the 2nd year, the office itself was gone, sublet to cover an immediate liability, and Gareth Morrow was working from a reduced apartment in a district he would not have previously acknowledged driving through. No staff, no morning briefings, no Theron Vance standing at the door. Just a kitchen table, an overhead fluorescent light that buzzed faintly when first switched on, and a laptop that now held spreadsheets instead of expansion plans. He did not allow himself to think about Claire during those months. That was what he told himself, that he was managing sequenced priorities, that the financial stabilization had to come first. that Claire was in capable hands with Margot, that Margot's ability to carry the weight of Claire's care was not something he was exploiting, but something he was temporarily relying on. These were the precise sentences Gareth Morrow used inside his own mind, in that specific order, whenever his daughter's face began to surface. They were very good sentences. They worked for almost 2 years. Margot Morrow filed for separation on a Tuesday in early spring. The filing itself was not a surprise. Gareth Morrow would later acknowledge, privately and only once, that he had felt it coming the way you feel a storm in the pressure of the air, long before a single cloud appears. What surprised him was the language of her petition. She did not cite the financial collapse. She did not cite the humiliation of the Galleria, or the investigation that followed, or the moral calculus of having an innocent young man arrested. She cited emotional abandonment, a legal phrase that, when Gareth Morrow read it the first time, he interpreted as vague and procedural. When he read it the second time, he understood that it was the most precise thing his wife had ever written about their marriage. She had been sitting with Claire Morrow through every failed session, with every expensive specialist for 2 years. She had been the one in the room when the behavioral team from the prestigious clinic shrugged and suggested they adjust Claire's medication regimen for the 4th time. She had been the one holding Claire's hand in the car. She had been the one calling the insurance company at 8 in the morning, and the facility coordinator at 9, and the neurologist's administrative assistant at 10. Gareth Morrow had been in restructuring meetings. The word abandonment was vague and procedural, and it was also completely accurate. Margot took Claire to a residential care facility recommended by their insurance provider. It was a clean facility, well staffed by clinical standards, with a sensory room and a daily activity schedule printed in laminated sheets. Claire Morrow deteriorated within 3 weeks, not because the facility was negligent, because Claire Morrow had never responded to protocol. She had never responded to structure that arrived without attunement. She had responded, exactly once in 6 documented minutes, to something entirely different, and that something had been removed from her life by the man who was supposed to protect her from all harm. The facility called Margot Morrow. At 2 in the morning following Claire's 3rd consecutive crisis episode. The episode had lasted 4 hours. Claire had not slept. She was physically exhausted and dysregulated in a way that the night staff described as beyond their management capacity. Margot sat in the parking lot of the facility in a green coat and dark jeans, her phone pressed to her ear, listening to the duty coordinator explain that they were recommending a transfer to a higher acuity placement. Then she sat alone in the car for a long time. She did not call Gareth Morrow that night. She waited until morning. When she did contact him, she did not call. She sent a message containing 1 sentence and 1 attached file. The sentence read, "I think it's time you read this." The file was a PDF, 41 pages, single-spaced, in Elaine Chu's careful handwriting that had been transcribed and formatted but deliberately preserved in its original first-person voice, because Elaine Chu had understood instinctively that the specificity of witness mattered more than the polish of presentation. Elaine Chu had titled the document simply, "What I Saw." It began at the moment she noticed Finnian Drake enter the food court, not from the entrance nearest the parking structure, but from the eastern corridor, a thermal delivery bag over one shoulder, a red and black jacket over gray joggers, moving at a practical pace that slowed and then stopped the moment he registered Claire. Elaine Chu had written down the precise sequence of his movements: the bag set down, the lowering to the floor, the crossed legs, the specific angle of his shoulders that she described as deliberately smaller, like he was trying to take up less of the world's space than he actually needed. She had written down what she could observe of his voice, not the words. She was too far back to catch the words, but the rhythm. She wrote, "It was slow, slower than conversation, more like breathing out loud." She had written down the 4-minute mark, when Claire's rocking began to change, the shift from violent and rhythmic to slower, Uncertain, searching, she had written down the 6-minute mark in a sentence that took Gareth Morrow several attempts to finish reading. The sentence read, "Claire stopped rocking. She turned her head. She looked at him like he was the only solid thing in the room. Then she reached out and put her hand in his. I have never seen my daughter do that with any person on this earth. Not once. Not ever." The following pages documented what happened next. The arrival of Gareth Morrow in the blue jacket and charcoal trousers. The appearance of Theron Vance. Elaine Chu had recorded the words she heard Gareth Morrow say. "He's not a therapist, he's a delivery driver." With the precision of someone who understood they were writing for a future that would need to know exactly what was said. She had recorded Officer Clint Rourke stepping forward. The physical removal, Finnian Drake standing without resistance. And then she had written the final entry of that section in a single short paragraph that occupied its own page, as though she had needed the white space around it to make it bearable. She wrote, "The moment he was taken away, Claire screamed. Not a cry, not a protest, a sound I do not have a word for. It lasted for 11 minutes. I counted because I didn't know what else to do with my hands." Gareth Morrow read the document at his kitchen table under the fluorescent overhead light that buzzed faintly in the quiet apartment. He read it once. He read it again. He sat for a very long time afterward, in a stillness that was not peace and not collapse, but something in between, the stillness of a man whose last available argument with himself has simply run out of words. There was nothing left to reframe. There was nothing left to manage. There was only the 41 pages and the fluorescent hum and the specific face of his daughter at the 6-minute mark that he had not been there to see but could now see entirely through another woman's witness. After a very long time, Gareth Morrow opened his laptop. He typed 2 words into the search bar, Finnian Drake. He pressed enter. He waited. The screen filled with results. The reckoning at last had a direction. The number was 22 months. Gareth Morrow sat at the kitchen table of his reduced apartment, a 2-bedroom on the 14th floor of a building he once would have passed without slowing down, with the glow of his laptop screen casting pale light across his face. Outside the windows, morning was arriving hard and bright, sunlight cutting through glass in long, flat angles across the linoleum floor. He had been awake since 3. Elaine Chu's document was still open in a separate tab. He had not closed it since the night Margot sent it to him 4 days ago. He kept returning to one line, the same line, like a man pressing his tongue against a cracked tooth. Her face, in that 6th minute, was the quietest I had ever seen it. He had clicked away from it 6 times. He had clicked back 7. The clinic's website was clean and professionally designed, which was the first thing that surprised him, not because he expected otherwise, but because some buried part of him had been hoping for a reason to dismiss it. He did not find one. Finnian Drake, BCBA, MS Behavioral Science, board certified, published in 3 peer-reviewed journals as a contributing clinician to Dr. Ingrid Nakamura's ongoing research. Areas of specialization: high support autism, co-regulation in nonverbal adolescents and adults, crisis de-escalation for complex sensory profiles. There was a professional photograph. Finnian Drake was 30 now. He was wearing a green button-up shirt over dark trousers, standing in a bright, naturally lit room, looking at the camera with an expression that contained no performance whatsoever, just steadiness. Gareth Morrow stared at that face for longer than he would ever admit to anyone. He called the clinic at 8:02 a.m. The moment the listed hours began, the receptionist answered on the 2nd ring. Her voice was even and unhurried, the voice of someone who managed complicated situations all day without raising their pulse. She introduced herself as Petra. Gareth Morrow said he needed to get his daughter onto the schedule as soon as possible. He used the word urgent. He used it twice. Petra told him, with the precision of someone who had delivered this information many times, that the current wait for new intake assessments was 22 months and that she could add his daughter's name to the list today if he provided basic clinical history and a referral from a licensed provider. He said he understood that, but that this was a special circumstance, that his daughter's situation was severe, that she had been in 3 facilities in the past 18 months, that she was currently in a stabilization unit, and that he was prepared to compensate at double the standard session rate to be seen sooner. There was a brief pause on Petra's end. Not uncomfortable, simply measured. She told him that she appreciated him sharing the severity of the situation, and that many of their clients came to them following multiple failed placements. That was, in fact, a clinical pattern the practice frequently served. She told him the waiting list was organized by clinical urgency and documentation completeness, not by financial capacity, and that the most effective way for his daughter to receive prioritized review was to submit a comprehensive clinical record for the intake coordinator to assess. She was not unkind. She was simply immovable, in the way that things built on principle tend to be. Gareth Morrow thanked her and ended the call. He sat back in his chair. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, a sound he had never noticed in his old apartment, because that apartment had had recessed lighting installed by an interior designer he had paid $11,000. He noticed it now. He noticed everything now, that the insulation of wealth had been stripped back. He tried the institutional route next. Dr. Ingrid Nakamura's research department at the university listed a professional inquiry contact. He sent a carefully worded email identifying himself as the parent of a high-support patient with documented complex needs and requesting a consultation referral through academic channels. The auto-response came within minutes. His inquiry would be reviewed and forwarded to the appropriate coordinator. He received a follow-up 3 days later from an administrative coordinator thanking him for his interest in the research program, explaining that clinical referrals through the department required existing professional relationships with licensed providers and directing him back to the clinic's standard intake process. He had been, in the language of bureaucratic architecture, politely redirected in a circle. He called Theron Vance out of habit and stopped himself on the second ring, remembering that Theron Vance had not been on his payroll for 8 months. He ended the call before it connected. He thought about Clint Rourke. He had not thought about Officer Rourke since the day at the mall, and he realized, sitting with that thought, that this was a revealing thing. He had never considered what Rourke felt about that afternoon. He had only ever processed that day from the center, himself as the axis around which all events orbited. Rourke was a function, a mechanism. Gareth Morrow had needed an arrest executed and a badge had been present to execute it. He found Rourke through a private security firm's website. He sent a message. Rourke responded in 2 hours. They met at a diner on a Wednesday morning. The kind of diner with green vinyl booths and a laminated menu that had not changed in 15 years. Overhead fluorescent tubes ran the length of the ceiling, filling every corner with flat, unsparing light. There was nowhere to hide in that light, which felt intentional, which felt appropriate. Rourke was in his early 40s now, broader across the shoulders than Gareth Morrow remembered. In a plain gray Henley and dark jeans, he was already in the booth when Gareth Morrow arrived. He did not stand when Gareth Morrow sat down. Gareth Morrow explained what he needed. He was measured about it, controlled. He needed a way to reach Finnian Drake outside the formal intake structure. He thought perhaps Rourke, given his role in the original incident, might have grounds to make contact. A personal appeal. Rourke listened without interrupting. When Gareth Morrow finished, Rourke turned his coffee cup once in his hands, looked at it, then looked up. He said, "I knew that day what I was doing was wrong. I want you to hear that clearly. I knew." He was sitting on the floor talking to a frightened girl, and she was calming down, and you walked in and told me to remove him, and I did it anyway. Because you had money and authority, and a badge has to respond to that. even when it shouldn't. I have thought about it more times than I can count." Gareth Morrow said nothing. Rohr continued, "I'm not going to help you get around his process. That man built something real after everything you put him through. You don't get to cut the line on that just because your situation got hard. If you want to reach Finnian Drake, there is one way to do it. You apologize publicly. You say what you did, and you say it in the open, where it costs you something. And then maybe he decides what he wants to do with that. But I'm not your back channel. Not for this." Gareth Morrow drove home through mid-morning traffic with the windows down, which he never used to do. He did not issue a public apology. Not yet. He told himself it was because he needed to focus on Claire's immediate situation. He told himself timing mattered. He was aware, somewhere beneath these explanations, that they were explanations rather than reasons. Instead, he went home and composed the anonymous consultation request himself. He used a personal email account with no identifying information, just a description of a patient, clinical language borrowed from the facility's intake documents. 24-year-old female, high support needs, non-responsive to current interventions, 3 placement failures in 18 months. He read it back, changed 2 phrases to sound less like a father and more like an administrator, and sent it. He felt briefly like he had done something productive. The clinic's response came the following morning. Petra's voice, translated into email, was exactly as composed as it had been on the phone. To complete the intake review, they would require the name and contact information of the referring licensed clinician, a signed records release, and the patient's full diagnostic history. Without the referring clinician's credentials, they were unable to process the inquiry further. Gareth Morrow stared at that email for 20 minutes. He had no referring clinician. He had constructed an anonymous shell, and it had been, with professional politeness, seen through. He closed the laptop. He did not respond. 340 miles away, in an office lit by a wide skylight that turned the entire room the color of afternoon, Finnian Drake was between sessions when his phone buzzed on the corner of his desk. He glanced at the screen. It was a text from Yolanda Ferris, which was normal. Yolanda texted him approximately 11 times per day and had for 6 years. But this one was only a link and a single emoji, a raised eyebrow. He had learned over the years that Yolanda's raised eyebrow meant she had found something and was giving him the choice of whether to look. He looked. The article was from a regional business publication, 8 months old. The headline was not cruel, which almost made it worse. Morrow Development Group dissolves following debt restructuring. Sources cite market exposure and investor withdrawal. There was a photograph of Gareth Morrow at what appeared to be a press conference, in a blue jacket over a white shirt, looking at a lectern. His jaw was set in that way Finnian Drake remembered, the particular angle of a man who believed the management of appearances was equivalent to the management of reality. Finnian Drake read the article through to the end. He set his phone down on the desk. Through the skylight above him, the afternoon light spread evenly across the room, across his bookshelves, across the carefully arranged sensory tools on the low table by the window, across the framed photograph on the wall that Yolanda had put there without asking, the one showing the cover of Dr. Nakamura's published case study with his name in the contributor list. He thought about the anonymous consultation email. He thought about the clinical language that had been just slightly off, the way a person sounds when they are trying to sound like someone else and almost succeeding. He thought about a 24-year-old woman in a stabilization unit somewhere, and a food court floor 7 years ago, and a 6-minute silence that one man had broken for no reason except that it was the right thing to do. He picked up his phone again. He did not call anyone. He did not type a reply. He simply sat in the bright, still room with what he now knew, turning it over in his hands like something that had not yet decided what it was going to become. Finnian Drake sat with the knowledge for 3 days. He did not call Gareth Morrow back. He did not forward the consultation request to his intake coordinator. He did not talk about it at work, did not mention it to Yolanda, did not open the article she had texted him a second time. He simply carried it, the way you carry something sharp in a coat pocket, aware of exactly where it is with every movement, careful not to let it cut you while you decide what to do with it. On the fourth day, he drove to his mother's apartment. Nadia Drake was in her kitchen when he arrived, standing at the counter in a green top and loose blue trousers, her reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead, peeling an orange with the slow, deliberate patience that had defined her for as long as Finnian could remember. The apartment was filled with natural light from the wide window above the sink, and the overhead fixture buzzed its familiar fluorescent warmth across the small, immaculate space. She looked up when he came in, studied his face the way mothers study faces, and said nothing. She set the orange down. She sat at the table, and then she waited. Finnian sat across from her and told her everything, not just the consultation email and the article, everything. The Westfield Galleria, the food court floor, the 6 minutes, and Claire Morrow's hand finding his. The moment Gareth Morrow arrived, and the sound of authority deciding what it was looking at before asking a single question. The arrest, losing the delivery account, the no-contact letter, the years of carrying a thing he had never done wrong. He told her about Dr. Nakamura and the fellowship and the clinic and the waiting list, and he told her about the email, and he told her he already knew exactly who had sent it. Nadia Drake listened to every word without interrupting. That was her particular genius. Not advice, not reaction, just the complete offering of her attention as a form of love. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator's hum. She looked at her son for a long moment. Then she asked her question, "What does the girl need?" Finnian didn't answer out loud. He pressed his lips together. He looked at the table. He nodded once, slowly, the way a person nods when they are agreeing with something they already knew and were hoping someone else might argue against. He stayed for dinner. He drove home, and the next morning, he picked up the phone. The meeting was set for Thursday at 11 in the morning. Finnian's clinic occupied the second floor of a converted building on Crestmore Avenue, and on Thursday the skylight above the main consultation room was doing what it always did in late morning, pouring clean, unobstructed daylight across the room in a way that left nowhere to hide and nothing to soften. Finnian arrived at 9. He sat with 2 client files. He drank his coffee. He was not nervous. He was very still in the way of someone who has already resolved the thing that would have caused nervousness. Gareth Morrow appeared in the doorway at 10:58. Finnian had prepared himself for many versions of this man. He had not fully prepared for this one. Gareth Morrow wore a faded blue jacket over a white-collared shirt and dark trousers that were clean but carried the particular flatness of clothes pressed by a person, not a service. He had no security behind him, no assistant beside him, no leather portfolio tucked under his arm. He was 61 years old, and he looked it entirely, not in illness, but in the specific way that consequence ages a face when there is nothing left insulating it from what it has done. He stood in the doorway for a moment that lasted longer than a moment, and then Petra, the front desk coordinator, gestured him toward the consultation room, and he walked through it the way a man walks into a room he knows he does not deserve to be in. Finnian was already seated when Gareth Morrow entered. The consultation room held 2 chairs and a low table between them, positioned under the skylight so that natural light fell on both parties equally. Finnian was wearing a deep orange shirt and dark trousers. He stood briefly as Gareth Morrow entered, not as deference but as courtesy, the same courtesy he offered every person who entered this room. And then he sat back down and gestured to the other chair. Gareth Morrow sat. For a moment neither man spoke. The light came down through the skylight and held them both. Then Finnian said, calmly, without preface, Tell me what you saw that day. From the beginning, your perspective." Gareth Morrow blinked. He had clearly prepared for something else, for confrontation, for demands, for a ledger to be read aloud. He had not prepared to be asked to speak first. He opened his mouth, closed it, then began slowly. He described arriving at the Galleria after Theron Vance's call, the crowd, his daughter on the floor. The fear that had hit him, he said, before anything else, not anger, fear, the particular terror of a parent who has failed to protect something irreplaceable. And then the stranger, a young black man in a delivery jacket sitting on the tile next to his daughter, and Claire's hand in his hand, and Gareth Morrow's entire nervous system having interpreted that image through every bias he had never examined and every assumption he had never interrogated. "I didn't see a person helping her," Gareth Morrow said. His voice was flat and factual, the way voices go flat when a person is describing something they are ashamed of and have run out of ways to soften. "I saw a threat that had gotten close to her. That's what I saw." Finnian nodded. He did not validate it. He did not condemn it. He simply said, "Thank you for saying that plainly." Then Finnian spoke. He described what he had actually seen when he walked through that food court 7 years ago. He described Claire Morrow's rocking pattern, the specific rhythm of it, the forward-back-forward sequence that indicated a nervous system overwhelmed beyond its capacity to self-regulate, and the particular way her fingers had been pressing into the pillar behind her, which told him she was seeking proprioceptive grounding, pressure-based input that would tell her body it still occupied a defined space in a world that had become unmanageably loud. He described sitting on the floor, not crouching, sitting, eliminating height from the interaction entirely, removing his physical frame from any position that could read as looming or authoritative to a nervous system already under siege. He described the voice he had used, low, rhythmic, not asking her to calm down, not asking anything of her at all, simply existing in her frequency, matching the tempo of her breathing with the tempo of his speech, offering his nervous system as something steady enough to borrow until hers found its footing. He told Gareth Morrow what he had said to Claire, the actual words, the ones the crowd could not hear, the ones that had been an open loop in this story for 7 years. He had not said anything remarkable. He had said, "You don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to do anything. I'm just going to sit here with you for a while. The floor is solid. It holds both of us. You're okay." That was it. That was the 6-minute miracle nobody wanted to see. Not a technique in the extraordinary sense. A human presence, calibrated, patient, and stripped of demand. And then Finnian told Gareth Morrow what had been lost. Co-regulation. The neurological process by which one nervous system stabilizes by orienting to another requires repetition to build trust architecture. In the 6 minutes on that food court floor, Claire Morrow's nervous system had located something it recognized as safe. Not Finnian as a person. She had no name for him, no history with him, but the pattern, the rhythm, the quality of presence that had never triggered her threat response. That kind of recognition, for a person with Claire's profile, does not come easily and does not transfer to strangers on demand. When she was separated from him, she did not lose a nice interaction. She lost the first mapped pathway her nervous system had ever built toward external regulation. And then that pathway had been severed before it could stabilize, and in the years that followed, her nervous system had been asked to find another one, and another, and had failed each time. Not because of lack of resources thrown at the problem, but because the problem was not a deficit in Claire. The problem was an absence. Finnian was still speaking when Gareth Morrow stopped being able to hold himself upright in the chair. It was not theatrical. That was the thing about it. There was no dramatic moment of tears, no hands covering the face. Gareth Morrow simply reached a point where the weight of what Finnian was describing and the full understanding of what his pride had cost his daughter became physically incompatible with sitting in a chair as though he were the same man who had arrived in one. He slid from the chair to his knees on the consultation room floor. His faded blue jacket settled around him. He looked at his own hands. He said, "I didn't ask. I never asked what you said to her. I saw a stranger touching my daughter and Finnian waited. The light from the skylight came down and held them both. Equal and unsparing, please," Gareth Morrow said. His voice was barely a voice at this point. "She has no one. Please." Finnian looked at this man on the floor. This diminished, broken, still breathing evidence of what arrogance costs. And he felt nothing as clean as satisfaction, and nothing as simple as pity. He felt the weight of his own answer, already made in a kitchen 4 days ago, and he spoke it. "One assessment session," Finnian said, "with Claire. No promises beyond that. And I need you to understand, in that room, I answer to her, not to you." Gareth Morrow nodded from the floor. Claire Morrow arrived on a Tuesday morning. She wore a yellow top and gray trousers, and she held her tablet against her chest like armor. Margot Morrow brought her and waited outside. Claire stood in the doorway of the bright consultation room, skylight blazing overhead, the room warm and uncluttered and quiet, and her body was already calculating the space, already running its assessments. Finnian did not move toward her. He simply sat, cross-legged on the low mat in the corner, and spoke in a voice so quiet it barely reached the walls. "You don't have to go anywhere," he said. "You don't have to do anything. I'm just going to sit here with you for a while." Claire Morrow went completely still. The tablet stopped moving in her hands. Her head tilted slightly, as though the sound was coming from somewhere she had been trying to locate for a very long time. Then, slowly, with the deliberate weight of something irreplaceable returning to where it had always belonged, she turned toward him. 6 months is not a long time. In the world of high-support autism care, 6 months is barely enough to establish trust, let alone measure it. But trust, it turns out, was always the variable that everyone else had skipped. Claire Morrow, 24 years old, sits at a round table in her own apartment on a Tuesday morning. The apartment is small and deliberately ordered. Warm-toned walls, a sensory corner with specific textures she chose herself, a skylight above the kitchen that floods the room with natural light from mid-morning through the afternoon. Finnian Drake helped design the structure of this space, not the decor. He consulted on the lighting, the sound insulation, the routing of daily routines into a sequence her nervous system could predict and therefore tolerate. The rest, the yellow curtains, the small succulent on the windowsill, the photo of her and a young woman named Bree pinned beside the door. All of that is Claire. Bree is from her day program. They do not talk much in the conventional sense. They sit near each other during art sessions and occasionally exchange tablets, pointing at images that seem to mean something only to them. It is by every clinical definition a friendship. Claire's care team documented it in her quarterly review without fanfare, but Margot Morrow read that line 3 times before she could move past it. Margot and Gareth Morrow are not reconciled. That is not where this story goes. What they are is cooperating, carefully, quietly, and without the performance of a united front they never actually had. Gareth Morrow attends Claire's monthly care meetings now. He sits in a chair against the wall in a faded blue jacket and does something he could not do when he had a security detail and a real estate empire behind him. He listens. He does not interrupt. He does not redirect. He does not reframe the professional's assessments through the lens of what he is paying for them. He sits. He absorbs. He signs whatever needs signing and asks, sometimes, one careful question on the way out. It is a small thing. It is not a small thing. Gareth Morrow works now at a mid-level consultancy firm. Commercial property analysis. No empire, no empire's shadow. He takes the bus on Tuesdays because parking near the office costs more than he chooses to spend. Nobody at the firm knows who he was. He has not corrected that. Elaine Chu submitted her written account to Dr. Ingrid Nakamura's research team 8 weeks ago. The paper that resulted, co-authored, peer-reviewed, published in a behavioral sciences journal with a circulation that reaches clinicians in 14 countries, is titled simply, Emergent Competence and Institutional Failure, a case study in the cost of unrecognized therapeutic presence. It does not name Finnian Drake. It does not name Claire Morrow or Gareth Morrow. It does not need to. The clinical community that reads it knows exactly what kind of moment it is describing, and they sit with it uncomfortably, because most of them have witnessed a version of it and done nothing. Finnian Drake does not attend the publication reception. Dr. Ingrid Nakamura sends him the journal link with a single line, "You are in here in the best possible way." He reads the abstract during a 10-minute break between sessions, sets his phone face down on his desk, and goes back to work. Yolanda Ferris, however, does not let it pass without ceremony. She screenshots the published paper, gets it printed at a copy shop on her lunch break, frames it herself in a plain black frame she bought for $11, and hangs it in Finnian Drake's waiting room on a Thursday afternoon while he is in session. She does not ask permission. When he notices it that evening, he stands in front of it for a long moment, then sends her a text that says only, "You are a problem." She sends back a photograph of herself grinning in the parking lot of the copy shop, orange jacket, blue jeans, holding the receipt like a trophy. The afternoon session on Friday runs long, as it sometimes does. The clinic room is bright. The skylight overhead pours natural afternoon light across the table in a wide, warm rectangle. Claire Morrow sits across from Finnian Drake in a green pullover and dark trousers, her tablet in front of her, her fingers moving through a communication sequence she has been refining for 3 weeks. She has gotten very good at this. The aptitude surprised her support team. It did not surprise Finnian Drake. He had seen what she could do when the noise was removed and the pressure was lifted, and the environment finally answered her. Instead of demanding she answer it, he says something quietly. Just a few words, an observation, a check-in, a small marker in the session's rhythm. Claire Morrow looks up from her tablet. She holds eye contact for 3 full seconds. Her chart will mark this. 3 seconds is a milestone. 3 seconds is a door opening. Then she looks back down at her screen. Her fingers resume their movement, but her hand, slowly, without announcement, slides across the table and comes to rest near his. Not on it, near it. 7 years ago, on a tile floor in a food court blazing with overhead fluorescent light, a delivery driver in a red and black jacket sat down next to a girl the world had decided was unreachable. He said something quiet. She took his hand. Then he was pulled to his feet and punished for it. He came back anyway. Some things, it turns out, cannot be arrested. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.